I'm Caleb Harris. Thanks for joining me. I'm really excited about this dining table because it's just gorgeous. Those slabs have a cool story, and I learned a new technique for joining tabletops during this build. Now, I picked up these slabs from my friend Matthew over at Citywood. Citywood is a hardwood slab dealer here in town in Memphis, Tennessee that specializes in getting slabs from trees that are headed to the landfill. Now, these particular slabs came from a tree that died on the property of the Stax Museum of Soul Music here in Memphis several years ago. And instead of waiting for it to come down and hurt somebody or damage property, they decided to have it taken down. And fortunately, Matthew was able to get his hands on it.
The first job is getting the slabs into the shop, which is a lot easier with the cart. Now, with the exception of how we're going to join the slabs, all the processes we're going to do are just common woodworking techniques. Everything is just bigger. After moving the slabs into the shop, the first step is the same as milling any lumber. Establish a flat face. To do this, we mounted the slabs to a sled to feed it through an awesome 30-inch Baxter Whitney planer. The sled gives us a flat reference surface to run on the bed of the planer. The slab gets shimmed to keep it stable and make sure the blades cut the slab flat instead of the feed rollers pushing it flat and then having the curve spring back when it comes out. For that reason, if there is any cupping, you want the open part of the seat to face up. All of the shims get brad nailed and the slab gets screwed to the sled for security. The screws are driven in towards the ends of the slab, which will be cut off anyway, so the screw holes aren't going to be a problem. Matthew works with large slabs all the time, so has some beautiful old equipment sized to handle these tasks. Of course, you don't need massive industrial equipment to make a table like this, or even one this size. I'll post cards and links in the description to videos where I smoothed the slab with hand planes, and where I built a jig that lets you do this with a router or even a circular saw. The sled goes through the planer until the first face of the slab is flat. You can tell that's happened once the planer knives have cut across the entire width and length of the slab. Then we can unmount the slab from the sled, flip it over, and plane the other side until both slabs are flat and the same thickness. After the slabs are thickness, we run both of them through the Time Saver wide belt sander. After they are joined, they're going to be too wide to fit. I mark pencil lines on the slabs as a guide, so once they're gone, we know it's been sufficiently and evenly sanded. These are still going to need some hand sanding, but doing this now is still going to cut down significantly on the sanding time later.
Now it's time to edge joint these slabs so they can be glued together. Now normally this is a really simple matter, just making 2 straight cuts and then running those over a jointer or a hand plane to make sure they're perfectly flat and then gluing them together. But these 2 slabs have some really interesting grain that matches each other really well. So I'm going to try a different technique where instead of using a straight line, I'm going to join these 2 on a curve that matches the grain in the slabs as best as possible, so that way it looks like one giant slab. Now the process for doing this is a little convoluted. I did a separate video explaining why it's kind of convoluted, and I'll put a card up in the link to that. But otherwise, back to action.
You can ignore those blue chalk lines. That's just where we would have straight line ripped the slabs. But as you should have gathered by now, there's nothing straight about this project. The first step is establishing the curve that will become the edge of the slab. The idea is to follow the grain, but keep the curves fair and sweeping. Tight curves or too much zigzag will draw attention. Now that the line is established, Matthew made the first router pass freehand. After the first pass was done, I cut off most of the excess with the jigsaw. If we had roughed in with the jigsaw first, there would have been less support for the router. With most of the waste gone, a few passes with a patterning bit quickly flattened the edge. However, the curve is pretty rough and has a lot of ripples in it right now because it's based on that first freehand pass. To smooth things out, I used a sander to establish a bevel on one of the edges. The 6-inch pad is wide enough that it doesn't follow all those little imperfections, but creates nice fair curves. Now the trick is making the rest of the edge as fair as that sanded edge. To do that, I set the patterning bit so the bearing will just barely kiss the top of the slab and follow that sanded line. Then it's just a few passes and the edge is looking much better. There was a little flap left from the gap between the bearing and the cutting edges on the bit, but some light sanding cleaned that up in no time. Before making the template, I went ahead and transferred the line to the other slab and roughed it out with a jigsaw just because I wanted a peek at what things would look like when finished. Just like the slabs, the first thing I do to make the template is rough it out with a jigsaw to minimize how much cutting the router will have to do. Then I lined up the template with a clean edge I made earlier and used a pattern bit to copy that profile to the template. With the template done, the rest of the process goes pretty quick. We extend the template over the edge of the slab a bit to give the router some clearance and clamp down the far slab just close enough to remove material down the entire length. The bit is only set deep enough to give enough surface for the bearing of the large template bit to ride on. This slab is cut with a 1/4 inch bit and a 3/8 inch bushing, so the bit is actually cutting 5/16 of an inch from the edge of the template. Now it's time to recut the first slab with the template. This cut is made with a 1/4 inch bit and a 3/4 inch bushing, so we're actually cutting a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the template. So there's only a 1/16 of an inch difference from the other slab, which is how we're able to get the curves to match so well. The only thing left is to put in a flush trim bit and flush up the rest of the slab's edge. Now the slabs are ready to be joined. I cut in some dominoes because there was one available at the shop where I was working, but you could also use biscuits or dowels to help alignment. Now that I've matched the edges in the most complicated manner possible, it's time for one of the most stressful glue ups I've done to date. I use a liberal amount of glue and take care to spread plenty inside of the mortises, as well as a little on each domino before tapping them in. Then it's a lot of running around the bench and awkwardly pipe clamping this thing. It took some work, but I was able to get good clamping pressure all around, and I knew it was working when the joint gave me that reassuring, even bead of glue squeeze out. With the slabs out of the clamps, it was time to do an edge treatment to get rid of the frail edge. I traced a line about 1 inch from the edge and did my best to follow the shape before cutting it out with a jigsaw. Sycamore has interlocked grain that grows in what can be described as a spiral. That can cause angled cracks on the edges of the slabs. The other edge of the slabs had some pretty severe cracks, so I had to cut back a lot farther to get rid of most of them. If you saw my last table video, the steps for squaring up the ends is going to be really familiar. I clamped a long straight edge down where I thought looked pretty straight relative to the edges and traced a line. I'll make the ends perpendicular to this line, which ensures the ends will be parallel to each other. To make the cut, I clamped down a piece of plywood as a saw guide, set the depth of my blade to just more than the slab, and make sure my cord is long enough and isn't going to snag anything. I'm cutting off so much because I'm also bringing the slabs down to the final length with these cuts. I do the same thing on the other end, but take one last measurement right before the cut just to make sure I don't cut off too much. There were some small cracks left on the edge that I was able to stabilize just using some medium CA glue. The face of the slabs had some fine cracks, and I decided to try a different technique to fill them. I rubbed in a good amount of sawdust from running the boards through the time saver, and then I laid a thin bead of CA glue on it and packed more sawdust on top. I would only use this on hairline cracks, and it worked pretty well. Thin CA glue is like water though, so to control the flow, I put some packing tape over the nozzle and poked a tiny hole in it. To fill in the wormholes and larger cracks, I went with my old standard of sawdust mixed with PVA glue. Then it was time for sanding. Now, this is never really fun for me, but I recently picked up an adapter so I could hook my shop vac up to my sander. Now, if you haven't done this, I highly recommend it. Even with my Mata sander, I was surprised by how clean the process was with the shop vac. And another sanding tip, I like to pull out a moving blanket, so after I sand aside, I don't have to put that sanded surface against my bench. And now for the most visually satisfying part, that first coat of finish. I used General Finish's Armor Seal on this, and man was the wood thirsty. Just in these quick clips, you can see how fast the wood soaked up the first coat. To prevent making any sawdust at the client's house, I pre-drilled the holes for the legs in my shop. To get the legs consistent, I put a straight edge down the middle of the slab and then measured each leg from the end and the middle of the slab. Then I used a framing square against that middle straight edge to keep all the legs square to each other. They don't have to be perfect, but for me, doing this seemed quicker than running around the table eyeballing and adjusting all of the legs until they came out good. Now delivery time. I wrapped the slab in several moving blankets to protect it on the trip and wrestled it into my truck. All that was left was to unwrap it, screw in the legs, and take some glamour shots. This was a pretty big project. The top finished out to 1 5/8 inch thick, 40 inches wide, and 8 feet long. I used 1/2 inch steel 3-prong hairpin legs for the base. I'll leave links in the description to all the products I used and Matthew's Instagram. And if you want to stay up to date on what I'm working on, I'm really on Instagram, and there will be a link below for mine as well. If you enjoyed this, please hit that thumbs up and leave me a comment. And if you want to help me get more content like this out, please consider supporting me on Patreon or just hitting that share button. Thanks.